presenting the study entitled Public Debt as Determinant of Economic Growth. Last year, the national debt hit a record $22 trillion. This high debt is a result of the government spending more money than it has every year, creating a need to borrow the money from other sources. And this national debt is only going to increase given that Congress just approved $3 trillion in relief spending. National debt is the amount of money a country owes its creditors. It's considered okay as long as the proceeds are used to stimulate the growth of the economy in a manner that will lead to a country's long-term prosperity. Governments will often borrow money to invest in programs to stimulate the economy during times of recession. However, debt does have some negative effects. If a country is seen as unable to pay back its debt, it's considered a risky economy. Foreign investors are more likely to pull their assets from risky market. Additionally, governments may try to offset the deficit by gaining more revenue to pay it off through higher taxes. Another detriment of debt could be its effect on GDP growth. GDP is the gross domestic product, the total values of goods produced, services provided in a country for 1 year. The growth rate is a percent increase in GDP from quarter to quarter. GDP can often be used as an indicator of the economic health of a country. For example, a recession is measured in 2 periods of negative GDP growth. It can also be used to compare the productivity of many countries, since the mode of measuring GDP is uniform and can be adjusted for inflation. Figure 1 represents the U.S. historical and current policy projections for the debt held by the public as a percent of GDP. It shows the accumulation of debt in context with the GDP, and the debt has been rising. As of 2017, the debt-to-GDP ratio was 76%. The U.S. Treasury projects the percentage of debt to GDP is going to continue to rise and overcome the GDP around 2040. This is a reasonable expectation, and this suggested point could come sooner than we expect given the increase in government spending over the last few months. One of the first studies to investigate the relationship between growth and debt was Reinhart and Rogoff's 2010 Growth in Time of Debt. They investigated advanced and emerging economies, and they found a weak relationship between debt GDP at normal levels, which they considered to be 0 to 90% debt GDP. However, once the debt GDP ratio reached 90%, they found a threshold where the country's growth would continue to become negative. A threshold is a point where once the debt GDP reaches that point, there will be a continuous decline in GDP growth from then on. Desai, in 2016, created a multiple regression variable model for predictors of GDP growth rate in India. He included macroeconomic indicators, inflation, manufacturing and service purchasing managers index, and interest rates. Each macroeconomic factor was studied individually, and overall, interest rates have a neutral effect on GDP growth according to Desai. Brito Gomez and Cejas in 2017 explored a dynamic relationship between public debt and economic growth using a non-parametric approach. They investigated 16 countries between 1977 and 2015. They found that the 90% debt GDP threshold drives select countries, and this threshold originates from the financial crisis 2008. The gap in literature is that not many studies have investigated debt, debt interest, and GDP together. Interest on debt is the total amount of money the government pays each year servicing the debt. It increases with the debt. Interest rates are a percentage of principal charged by the lender for the use of this money. Interest rates vary depending on the country and the risks the country's bonds have. Figure 2 shows interest on the debt compared to other government expenditures in the United States. Based on the Congressional Budget Office predictions, interest on the debt will exceed many other government expenditures such as defense and Medicaid in the coming years. The hypothesis of this study is that there is a negative relationship between debt growth rates and GDP growth rates that operates when the ratio of debt growth rates to GDP growth rates passes the threshold value. Additionally, this study expects there to be a negative correlation between debt interest rates and GDP growth rates. The data gathered for this study includes developed and developing countries based on the UN classification. The UN bases its classification on fuel export, per capita gross national income, and other factors. All this data was gathered from the International Monetary Fund's online resources. The IMF publishes a range of time series data on IMF lending, exchange rates, other economic financial indicators. All data is in percentages to avoid currency convergence. Data gathered includes interest payments as a percent of revenue, general government gross debt as a percent of GDP, and real GDP growth as annual percentage change. The inclusion criteria was data is available continuously for all years, data is available for all variables. This was in order to maximize the number of countries and years that could be included in the data set. Part of the analysis was separating the data into debt categories: below 30%, 30-60, 60-90, and above 90% debt to GDP. This methodology was based on Reinhart and Rogoff's 2010 Growth in Time Debt. But differences are that this study included continuous data. This study weighed by country year rather than by country. Equal weighting by country gives 1-year episodes as much weight as nearly 2 decades in the above 90% public debt to GDP range. Weighting by country year is more conventional because it provides perspective for the year. Figure 3 is a scatter plot relating debt to GDP growth for 19 developed countries from 1992 to 2018. The next 3 graphs I will be showing you are for developed countries. Based on the linear regression, there is a negative relationship between the two variables. Figure 4 is a bar graph relating debt to GDP categories GDP growth for the same 19 countries as included in Figure 3. This bar graph shows that no threshold could be definitively ascertained. However, increased debt correlates with lower growth, suggesting a negative relationship between the two. The ANOVA supports this, that at different debt categories, GDP growth is significantly different with a p-value of less than 0.05 at a p-value of 0.002. Figure 5 is a scatter plot relating debt interest to GDP growth for 31 developed countries from 1996 to 2016. Based on the linear regression, debt interest and GDP growth have a weak negative relationship. The next 3 figures I will be showing you relate just to developing countries. Figure 6 is a scatter plot relating debt to GDP growth for 37 developing countries from 1992 to 2018. Based on the linear regression, a weak positive relationship was found between debt to GDP and GDP growth. Figure 7 is a bar graph relating debt to GDP categories GDP growth for the same 37 developing countries as included in Figure 6. There is no significant difference between the bars, as shown by an ANOVA with a p-value greater than 0.05 at 0.865. Figure 8 is a scatter plot relating interest on debt to GDP growth for 20 developing countries from 1996 to 2016. Based on the linear regression, interest on debt and GDP growth have a negative relationship that is steeper than found for developed economies. Also included in this study was a multiple regression model. This is the multiple regression equation that was used to model the data for developed and developing countries. The reason for the square terms is to see if a threshold existed. The betas are the predicted coefficients. Table 1 is summary statistics for the developed countries multiple regression model from 1996 to 2018, including 28 developed countries. Based on the terms, a threshold is predicted, but this threshold falls outside the range of normal data. Therefore, no threshold was found lest there be extrapolation. However, this model does provide evidence of a negative relationship between debt to GDP and GDP growth. Table 2 is summary statistics for developing countries multiple regression model from 1996 to 2018, including 10 developing countries. Based on the data, a threshold is once again predicted, but this threshold falls outside the range of normal data. Therefore, no threshold was found lest there be extrapolation. However, this model does provide evidence of a positive relationship between debt to GDP and GDP growth. Parts of my hypothesis were supported. For example, there is a negative relationship between debt to GDP and GDP growth for developed economies, and a negative relationship exists between debt interest and GDP growth for both groups of countries. However, there was no evidence to support threshold, and there was a neutral relationship found between debt to GDP and GDP growth for developing economies. Some limitations of this study were that specific data is not available across all online sources, and there's also a social desirability bias. All the data was self-reported, so countries may have tampered with their statistics in order to attract investors and boost their economy. Additionally, data is sometimes incomplete. Missing years of data resulted in exclusion of many countries from the dataset. This research is vitally important given that the impact of rising interest is often not considered in this research. However, interest on the debt is consuming government funds and negatively affecting GDP growth, based on the study. It is also important to bring attention to the detriment of debt. Debt can have so many negative impacts on growth for developed countries, including the United States. Additionally, it is important to influence policy measures and prevent the outrageous growth that is predicted. Future research should include if the relationship found for groups of countries are in accordance with the relationship found for individual countries. Future research should also investigate more groups of countries, such as African countries or OECD countries, and use other statistical methods to investigate relationships between growth and debt, considering a moving average model or a time series model. Here are my references. Thank you very much for listening.